When people find out that I conceal carry a 5-shot snub-nosed revolver, the question that I usually get is, am I stupid? There was a time when carrying a pocket revolver made a lot of sense. It was reliable, concealable, and 5 shots? Well, not that big of a deal when everyone else had full-sized 6-shot revolvers or single-stack semi-automatic pistols that usually had less than 10 rounds. But this is 2026. There are pistols around the same size as a 5-shot snub-nosed revolver, except they can carry 15 plus rounds, and not to mention they are easier to shoot for most people and also very reliable. And so this goes back to the original question, am I stupid and was I dropped on my head as a child? And the answer to the second question is numerous times. However, I will explain my logic and reasoning for concealed carrying a 5-shot revolver in 2026, alongside why I think it is one of the better carry options, but I need to make a few disclaimers. Notice how I said why I carry a 5-shot revolver. This video isn't meant to tell you specifically watching this that you need to carry a revolver or that your current carry option is stupid if you are carrying. Carry whatever you want legally, of course. I am also a civilian with, at least to my knowledge, nobody actively trying to hunt me down. So if you've got people trying to turn you into furniture with Dracos and switches, while you're more than welcome to stay, a 5-shot snubby is probably not for you. And speaking of primary carry guns, I do not only carry a revolver, as I have other carry options that I go with from time to time when I'm in the mood, but this revolver is my primary concealed carry gun and the weapon I have on me most of the time. And so with that being said, my reasoning for why the snub-nosed revolver is a solid carry choice will be divided up into 5 sections: lethality, legality, concealability, comfortability, and rebuttals, where I will respond to some counterpoints I expect people to bring up. Beginning with lethality. Lethality in this context is asking the question, does a firearm like this have what it takes to stop a threat? And so let's start by understanding what we are even looking at. This is an airweight Smith & Wesson 642 double action only snub-nosed revolver. It is also one of the most difficult guns to shoot. A common beginner mistake is that when someone goes to a shooting range and when picking out which gun to rent, they gravitate towards that small pistol because, according to many movies and video games, big gun equals more power and therefore harder to control. Meanwhile, small gun equals light and easy to handle. Context, of course, does matter, such as what caliber you are shooting. However, in this kind of revolver that is rated for 38 Special Plus P, in fact, there are some snub-nosed revolver rated for 357 Magnum, this is quite snappy for most people. And not only is it snappy, you typically want it to be double action only, which means no exposed hammer. No exposed hammer means that there is less of a chance for it to get snagged on something, alongside the fact that you should train to shoot double action with a defensive revolver, as not only is it a good skill to have, but you most likely will not have time to cock the hammer back after each round in a defensive shooting situation. A double action trigger means a long, heavy pull that most people will suck at shooting without proper training. And since this is a snub-nosed revolver, you also have a shorter sight radius, which makes it harder to accurately shoot at long ranges. And on top of all that, you get only 5 shots. And so what you have is a firearm that is snappy, more difficult to learn when compared to most semi-automatic alternatives, and above all, has fewer rounds to shoot. Okay, I know I have done a terrible job at convincing you why you should consider carrying a weapon like this, and so what justifies this choice as a primary everyday carry? Most defensive shootings are between 3 to 7 yards, with the majority of those shootings being at 3 yards. This is according to FBI crime statistics. And yes, I know the data isn't perfect as it covers cases of officers who are assaulted or killed, not every single self-defense shooting, but it is still something to go off of. Even if you don't agree exactly with the 3 to 7 yard distance, we can conclude by using those FBI statistics alongside various footage of self-defense shootings that these occurrences differences usually happen in what you would call short range. This doesn't mean you shouldn't learn how to shoot at longer ranges, but the point of me bringing this up is that you most likely don't need your carry gun to nail a target 100 meters away. Yes, these sights are pretty plain, as they are for most snub-nosed revolvers. However, they are more than adequate in the vast majority of defensive shooting encounters. If you miss a man-sized target at 7 yards and closer, I promise you it isn't because the sight radius was too short. What this means is that the ranges this revolver is expected to perform at are perfectly reasonable for most defensive shooting encounters. There is also the legal aspect of things, and while I'm not a lawyer, and keep in mind I live in Illinois, so I'm going to go off the laws there, typically the further you shoot someone, the less of a self-defense case you have. And so the question isn't even just, can you nail someone 50, 100 meters away with a pistol, but also, do you want to? And so going back to the topic of lethality, let's address only having 5 shots. Only having 5 shots does mean that you do need to train more in order to make the most of those 5 shots. As I said from the beginning, carrying an air-weight snub-nosed revolver is not a good idea for those who are still new to shooting. That being said, most defensive shooting encounters hover at 3 shots in under 5 seconds at 3 yards, according to the same FBI statistics. And to stop a threat, shot placement is extremely important. In other words, if someone who is on drugs starts to attack you, the person with a 5-shot revolver is going to need more skill and training in order to deliver those 5 rounds on target and at vital spots to stop the threat, compared to say someone with a 10 to 15 shot, if not more, semi-automatic pistol. But 5 rounds of 38 special plus P is not an unreasonable low amount to have for a self-defense weapon. No, I am not saying that 5 shots will be enough for every single self-defense encounter, something that I'll respond to in my rebuttal section of the video. What I am saying is that if a normal but trained civilian has only a 5-shot revolver on them, that is not something that the average threat can just ignore. Regarding the 38 special plus P, assuming it has a proper defensive load, it may not be the most powerful or modern option available, but it can be adequately used in self-defense encounters and has proven effective throughout history. This is not a new cartridge, and so to summarize this segment, a revolver like this does have disadvantages, such as requiring more time to train as it is harder to use alongside a more limited capacity, but going off of actual self-defense shootings we see in the real world, the ranges a defensive carry gun is expected to perform at alongside the rounds being fired are reasonable but not perfect for a revolver like this. But whatever the revolver loses in capacity, it gains back in the following categories. And so let's start with legality. There are people out there who say that they don't care what firearm they use, how many rounds they fire, or even the legality of what they are using as long as they survive the encounter, as they would rather be alive and wrong than dead and right. And to an extent, I see the logic in this. If it was in the middle of the night and I was getting some of that gas station sushi only to run into a threat that wants to take my life and all I had on me was a pistol with perhaps an extended magazine that is over the legal capacity permitted by the state, I would rather defend myself in the heat of the moment and then explain myself in court than die. I would also argue that surviving a self-defense encounter and then spending the rest of your life behind bars is also not exactly ideal. And so there is some nuance in this, as someone else can also argue, what's the point of surviving a self-defense encounter if you spend the rest of your life in prison? Keeping that in mind, carrying a 5-shot revolver gives you a potential legal advantage. When people are under stress during a gunfight, it is typical for them to squeeze off more rounds than necessary and at times completely empty their magazine. By the way, there is plenty of footage of this online. I am, for obvious reasons, not going to be showing anybody getting mag dumped on this YouTube video, but if you don't believe me, go on Twitter or something and at your own discretion, because I promise you the examples I'm talking about are not hard to find. Anyways, in a self-defense shooting, you are told to shoot until the threat is stopped, not necessarily when the threat is killed. This is important because if your threat goes down and you decide to fire a quote-unquote finishing shot, even if you didn't do it intentionally, maybe because you were under adrenaline adrenaline or something like that, you are now also facing charges and can potentially be placed in prison for the rest of your life. And so a 5-shot revolver means that even when filled with adrenaline, you are dumping 5 rounds into your target and not 15 plus rounds, which can help your case potentially and justify it as a legal self-defense shooting. Furthermore, you are responsible for every single round that leaves your weapon. There's no, oops, I missed and I killed a bystander, I'll do better next time. You will be held responsible even if you had honest intentions. And so 5 shots means that you hopefully don't overshoot the threat, giving you a better legal defense, but also that you don't send rounds flying in places you don't want as you're filled with adrenaline. And while the legal aspect is a potential advantage, now we start talking about where the revolver really shines: concealability and comfortability. When it comes to concealed carry, not all parts of the gun are equal. Of course, all of this depends on what exact position you're carrying in, and so I am generalizing, but usually the hardest part of the firearm to conceal is the rear of the slide and grip. When you print, meaning that someone can see the outline of your gun, it is typically that back portion of the gun sticking out. With a double action revolver, which is the type of revolver you should conceal carry, where the slide should be is a rounded off section. It doesn't seem like a big deal at first, until you remember that when it comes to concealed carry, a small change can make a huge difference. Because of both the rounded back and snubbier grip, as there's no magazine to deal with like in a semi-auto, what you get is a weapon that is crazy easy to hide and a major advantage for concealed carry. And speaking of semi-automatics, there are many compact options out there. In fact, I have a Glock 43X here that can use a 10-round default magazine or a 15-round metal magazine by Shield Arms, albeit the 15-rounder does jam a lot for me. Now, the reason why I still prefer the revolver is again that easier to conceal profile, at least on my body. Another potential advantage of a revolver is that you can't limp wrist it under stress by having a poor grip and accidentally cause it to jam. You can also fire it under clothing and inside of a pocket, although you can debate how actually relevant these advantages are, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Regarding muzzle length, a shorter muzzle means that the firearm can potentially tilt away from you while you're carrying. That isn't too much of a concern, as you can get a special claw attachment for your holster to prevent it from tilting, which most modern holsters should have if you do need it. At the same time, a shorter firearm is more comfortable when you bend over or sit down because there's less gun jamming into you, and the comfort level also depends on your concealed carry position. And speaking of carry position, I use a holster by Watchdog Tactical, not sponsored by the way, I just use it, and you can clip it onto your waistband or belt alongside adjusted tension as needed. What this means is that while actively carrying, you can change the position of it on your body so that it doesn't dig into you when you sit down, as well as being able to easily take it off your body for whatever reason. A firearm being concealable is also not just important from a self-defense perspective, where you don't want the threat to know that there is a gun on you, but also from just the day-to-day aspect of living. For legal reasons, I'm not saying I've done this before, but in Illinois, you are not allowed to conceal carry a weapon on public transportation as well as in many other places. So if you do want to take public transportation to get to a place, then what that means is that you either don't carry or you do it without telling anyone, and I've most definitely not done that before. Furthermore, even if you are in a perfectly legal place to carry, there is also a chance that someone spots a firearm on you and loses their minds. Yes, I know some people are going to say that they don't care, but at least for me, and I'm only speaking for myself here, I would rather run my errands and then go back to my house to binge watch some YouTube videos while eating some snacks, than spend a few hours being interrogated because some civilian spotted my CCW on me, freaked out, and now I'm caught up in some shenanigans. When it comes to how comfortable something is to carry, this is when things get really controversial. There are people out there who carry a full-size pistol with a spare magazine with the logic that if they do get into a defensive shooting scenario, that they want to be as well equipped as they can be and have more than they probably would need, as most defensive shootings don't involve a reload. Like I said before, you carry whatever you want, and if you like to carry a full-size pistol and or spare magazines, do whatever you want legally, as it is your life and your weapon. The point of me bringing this up is that while I do understand somewhat the logic behind carrying such things, you can't just dismiss how comfortable something is to carry. Whenever I meet people who say something along the lines of, who cares if carrying a full-size pistol with a spare magazine is uncomfortable? You shouldn't put comfort over having the tools to defend your life. I get somewhat confused by this logic because that is not how people have operated since the beginning of when people could carry weapons. Let me give you an example. example. Here is a civilian and a bandit. Legality aside, let's assume both are equally trained and physically fit enough to handle whatever weapon we give them. The civilian has a dagger on them to protect themselves, but what happens if the bandit has a sword? Okay, fine, let's give the civilian a spear to give them a leg up, as the person with the longer weapon in this context has the advantage, as the bandit has to first survive the strikes being delivered by the spear in order to close that distance and then use their own weapon. But what if the bandit does close that distance? Fine, alright. Let's give the civilian a backup sword to use. But what if the bandit has a projectile? Alright, fine. Let's also give the civilian a shield. But what if there's more than one attacker? Fine, let's give the civilian some armor to increase survivability. On paper, again assuming that the person is fit enough to carry and handle all of that gear, this person has the advantage or is equally armed in most encounters that they will face. So, why doesn't everyone dress like this? Because even if you could afford and carry all of that gear and weapons, the vast majority of the time you are carrying a weapon, historically and presently, you are not using it. Suddenly, the spear becomes a hindrance because while it might give you an advantage in an actual fight, carrying around a 6 feet plus pointy pole is not exactly easy. And so instead of a huge shield that gets you kicked out of parties, you decide to go with a buckler or nothing at all. Instead of wearing a helmet and other armor, you decide to just wear civilian clothes out of convenience and comfort. This is not anything new. For anyone that has been in the military, any military from around the world, how heavy something is and how comfortable and convenient something is to carry are all factors you notice, even if you don't always get a say in whether or not you want to carry it. And so now we can focus on how something also being concealable and practical makes it outshine many other options. For one, if something is more comfortable to carry, you are more likely to carry it. Yes, it is easy to be at a gun shop and want to pick the biggest, baddest option available, but for lots of people, maybe not you watching specifically, they stop carrying that weapon because it is too uncomfortable and inconvenient. And so now you don't even have 5 shots. You can say that it is a training issue or lack of discipline, and sure, I agree to an extent, but you cannot ignore the human factor that people throughout history and presently want to be comfortable, or at least comfortable as possible with the things they carry. And speaking of comfortable, an air raid revolver is insanely comfortable to carry. I have already talked about just how easy this thing is to hide alongside other perks like being able to wear this with sweatpants, shorts, and less conventional clothing for concealed carry, with the additional perk that you can easily slip this into a pocket holster and keep it in the outside pocket of a coat on a cold day for easier access. Not to mention that people usually don't just carry a weapon and nothing else, and so when you're loaded up with a phone, wallet, keys, hydrochloric acid, and everything else you might find yourself carrying in your day-to-day life, a more concealed and comfortable weapon is nice to have. Now let's get into the rebuttal section where I will address potential counterpoints. Some might see this video and go, you said a 5-shot revolver is sufficient for the majority of self-defense encounters, but what happens if you run into those rare circumstances where you are outgunned? Everything has a trade-off. There is no weapon on this earth, at least in 2026, I don't know what kind of a crazy wonder weapon the future holds, where a weapon doesn't have pros and cons. In this instance, you are sacrificing firepower, yes, for comfort and concealability. However, the sacrifice in firepower doesn't take you out of the fight, as 5 shots of 38 Special or 357 Magnum is not an unreasonable low amount to have, assuming you have the proper training, and again I already spent an entire section talking about this. But what you gain is tenfold in other aspects, which is being more comfortable to carry in day-to-day life and the ease of having the firearm concealed, which is the vast majority of the time you are concealed carrying, not to mention the potential legal aspect of things. Another response I see potentially coming is someone asking about facing individuals on substances like PCP that makes them eat 10 plus rounds before dropping. To that I have to say, shot placement still matters. 2 to 3 well-placed 38 Special plus P rounds to vital areas is almost certainly going to stop an attacker, as no matter how much drugs you're on, it's not going to magically fuse back together your spinal cord or heart if it took a round of 38 Special. Of course, the person shooting a semi-automatic can also do the same thing and hit the vitals, but the point of me bringing this up is that if you do face a person amped up on substances, it's not like with a revolver, you have no options and you're just screwed. I mentioned how more training is needed to get proficient with a double action revolver, and a potential rebuttal is why not spend that same time training with a semi-auto. The physical advantages of carrying a revolver aside, this is also not a zero-sum game. If you are a good shot at shooting a revolver in double action, you are most likely going to be an excellent shot with most semi-automatics, which are typically going to have a lighter and easier trigger pull. Now, I have no data to back that up other than my observations working on a pistol range, but I do generally notice people who are primarily trained on revolvers being better shots when switching over to a semi-automatic pistol compared to someone going from a semi-auto to another semi-auto. In summary, a 5-shot airweight revolver may not be packing the most punch. However, it is not an unreasonable amount to carry for reasons I have already stated like 1,000 times. The vast majority of the time a person is carrying a weapon, they are not using it. Therefore, having comfort and convenience in your everyday carry improves your quality of life and incentivizes you to actually have it on you as much as you can. Thank you for watching and making it to the end, and if you want to hear me yip and yap more about firearms and military stuff, check out my gaming videos, as I like to squeeze in some of those educational segments into those videos alongside my dedicated playlist for military stuff. Bye.